Biker thought the homeless man was stealing gas. What he discovered next left him in tears. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the highway still wept. Dalton killed his engine at the edge of Mercer's Fill-Up, the only station for 40 miles that still pumped gas after midnight, and watched the figure crouched beside his brother's motorcycle. The bike, a 1987 Harley Softail with a cracked leather seat and a fuel tank painted the color of dried blood, hadn't moved from that spot in 19 months. Not since they'd buried Reed, not since the club had voted to leave it there as a monument, chained to the pump island like a headstone nobody had the heart to move. And now, some homeless drifter was on his knees beside it, hands cupped beneath the tank, catching the rainwater that pooled in the dented chrome, or so Dalton thought. His fists tightened on his handlebars, his jaw set like concrete. He was 47 years old, president of the Iron Veil MC for 11 of those years, and he had buried more brothers than he could count on both hands. But he had never let anyone touch what belonged to the dead. Wait, before the next ride begins. If this story already hit you right in the chest, tell us where you're watching from. To ride with the Brotherhood through the next promise, loss, or redemption, subscribe and join the club. Engines up, back to the road. The gravel crunched beneath Dalton's boots as he dismounted. The night air smelled of wet asphalt and diesel, that particular perfume of empty roads and long hours. Behind him, the neon sign of Mercer's flickered pink and blue, buzzing like a dying wasp. The station had been closed for 3 hours, but old Mercer left the pumps unlocked for the club, always had. It was an arrangement that went back further than Dalton's memory, back to when his father had worn the patch, back to when the Iron Veil meant something more than a name stitched on leather. The homeless man didn't move, didn't flinch. He remained crouched beside Reed's bike, his back to Dalton, shoulders hunched beneath a coat that had once been army green, but was now the color of mud and forgetting. His hands weren't cupped beneath the tank anymore. They were pressed flat against the fuel cap, palms down, like a man praying at an altar. Step away from the bike. Dalton's voice cut through the silence like a blade through smoke. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. 20 years of leading men had taught him that volume was for the weak. Authority lived in the quiet spaces, in the pauses between words. The homeless man's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, Dalton thought he might run. Most of them did. The drifters, the addicts, the lost souls who wandered through truck stops looking for something to sell or steal. But this one didn't run. He turned, slowly. And when the neon light caught his face, Dalton felt something cold slide through his chest. The man was old, older than Dalton had expected. His beard was white and tangled, reaching nearly to his chest, and his eyes, pale blue, almost colorless in the flickering light, held a depth that didn't belong to a thief. There were scars on his face, old ones, the kind that came from road rash and broken glass. His hands, still raised slightly in a gesture of surrender, were calloused and thick, the hands of a man who had once known work, real work, the kind that left marks. "I wasn't stealing," the old man said. His voice was rough, like gravel poured through rust. "I was just remembering." Dalton stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the tremor in the old man's hands, close enough to smell the rain and smoke that clung to him like a second skin. Remembering what? The old man lowered his hands. He looked at the motorcycle, at Reed's motorcycle, with an expression Dalton couldn't name. It wasn't covetousness. It wasn't even admiration. It was something closer to grief. Something that lived in the same dark corner of the soul where Dalton kept his own losses. "This bike," the old man said quietly, "I know this bike." Dalton's eyes narrowed. That bike belonged to my brother. He's been dead 19 months. So, unless you knew him, I knew him. The words landed like stones in still water. Dalton felt the ripples spread through him, disturbing everything he thought he understood about this moment. Who are you? The old man reached into his coat. Dalton's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Not a gun, never a gun, not since the accident in '09. But the old man wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a piece of cloth, folded small and tight, and held it out in the neon light. It was a patch. Faded, frayed at the edges, but unmistakable. The Iron Veil insignia. A skull wrapped in chains, a single eye burning through the dark, stared back at Dalton like a ghost. "My name is Ezra Cole," the old man said, "and 43 years ago, I was the one who founded this club." The clubhouse sat 3 miles off the main highway, down a dirt road that hadn't seen a county maintenance truck since the Reagan administration. It was an old building, a converted barn, really, with concrete floors and walls thick enough to stop a bullet. The Iron Veil had called it home for as long as anyone could remember. The sign above the door, hand-painted by a brother who died in '94, read simply, "Loyalty, Silence, The Road." Dalton led Ezra Cole through the front door at 1:30 in the morning. The main room was empty. Most of the brothers had gone home hours ago, back to wives or girlfriends, or the particular loneliness that came with the patch. Only Bishop remained, asleep on the couch with a bottle of bourbon cradled against his chest like a child. He didn't stir as they entered. "Sit," Dalton said, gesturing to a chair near the cold fireplace. He crossed to the bar, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and carried them back. He handed one to Ezra and kept the other for himself. "Now talk, and don't leave anything out." Ezra took the glass, but didn't drink. He stared into the amber liquid as if searching for something lost in its depths. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "I was 26 when I started the Iron Veil. Young, stupid, full of all that fire that burns in men who don't know what fire costs yet." He paused, turning the glass slowly in his scarred hands. "There were 7 of us at the beginning. Brothers from the war, Vietnam, if that tells you anything about how long ago this was. We came home and found out that home didn't want us anymore. So we made our own." Dalton listened in silence. He had heard pieces of this story before, fragments, legends, the kind of mythology that accumulates around any organization old enough to have history. But he had never heard it from the source. He had never even known the source still lived. "The club was different then," Ezra continued. "We weren't outlaws. We weren't criminals. We were just men trying to find something worth living for after we'd spent 3 years learning how to die." He looked up, meeting Dalton's eyes. "Your father was one of the 7. Did you know that?" Dalton felt his throat tighten. He never talked about the early days. No, he wouldn't have. Ezra's gaze drifted to the wall, where a row of photographs hung in simple frames. Faces of the fallen. Brothers who had taken their last ride. Marcus Knox was the best of us, the steadiest. When things went wrong, and things always go wrong, son, that's the nature of the road, Marcus was the one who held us together. He had a way of seeing through the anger, through the fear, to whatever truth was hiding underneath. "What happened to you?" Dalton asked. The question had been building since the gas station, since the moment he'd seen that ancient patch in Ezra's hand. "You founded this club. You should have been president until you died. Instead, there's no record of you past 1983. No photos, no stories. It's like you just vanished." Ezra was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound, the sound of something searching for its pack. "I did vanish," he said, finally. "I had to." "Why?" Ezra set his glass down on the table beside him. He reached into his coat again, and this time he pulled out a photograph. It was old, creased, the colors faded to sepia and shadow. But the image was clear enough. 7 young men standing beside their motorcycles, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the reckless joy of those who have not yet learned what loss tastes like. "You see the man on the far right?" Ezra asked, holding the photo toward the light. "That's Carl Jessup. We called him Deacon. He was my best friend, my brother in every way that mattered." Dalton leaned forward, studying the face. Young, handsome, with a smile that seemed to promise trouble. "I've heard that name, Deacon. Some of the older brothers mention it sometimes. Never anything specific." "No, they wouldn't." Ezra's voice had gone flat, the way voices do when they're carrying too much weight. "Deacon died in the summer of '83, and I'm the one who killed him." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned out years ago. Dalton didn't move, didn't speak. He had learned over the years that silence was often more powerful than questions, that men would fill empty space with truth if you gave them room enough to breathe. "It wasn't murder," Ezra said, "not the way you're thinking. It was an accident. A stupid, senseless accident that happened because I was drunk and angry and too proud to let someone else take the lead." He closed his eyes. "We were running a delivery. Nothing illegal, just parts for a shop down in Tulsa. Deacon said we should wait until morning, said the roads were too slick, the weather too bad. But I wouldn't listen. I was the founder, the president. I didn't take orders from anyone." He opened his eyes, and Dalton saw something there that he recognized. The same look he saw in his own mirror some mornings. The look of a man who had made a choice he could never unmake. "We hit a patch of black ice on Route 66 just past the Oklahoma border. I went down first. Deacon was right behind me. He tried to avoid my bike, tried to swerve, and he went off the road, into a ravine. By the time I got to him, he was already gone. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. Neither man moved to add more wood. The club covered it up," Ezra continued, "called it a solo accident, told the cops Deacon had been riding alone, that I wasn't even there. Your father arranged the whole thing. He said it was better for everyone, for the club, for Deacon's family, for me. He said guilt was punishment enough." Ezra's laugh was bitter, hollow. He was wrong. Guilt isn't punishment. Guilt is a prison you carry with you everywhere you go. And the only way I could survive it was to disappear, to leave everything behind, the club, the road, the brothers, and spend the rest of my life trying to become someone who deserved to keep breathing. Dalton finally spoke. "And did you become that person?" Ezra looked at him. In the dim light, his eyes seemed older than his face, older than his body, older than the years he had lived. "I don't know. I spent 4 decades trying. Worked in shelters, soup kitchens, anywhere I could give something back without taking anything in return. I never rode again, never touched a motorcycle. I thought maybe if I gave enough, helped enough, I could balance the scales somehow." He shook his head slowly. "But scales don't balance that way. Some debts don't have a price. They just have a weight, and you carry it until you can't anymore." "So why come back now, after all this time?" Ezra reached into his coat one final time. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, and handed it to Dalton. "Because 3 months ago, I got this. It was forwarded through a dozen different addresses, places I lived, shelters I stayed at, people who owed me favors. Took it that long to find me." Dalton opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a script he recognized immediately. His brother's handwriting. Reed's handwriting. "Ezra, I know you probably won't get this. I know you've spent your whole life running from what happened, and maybe that's the only way you could survive it. But I need you to know something. I found out the truth about Deacon, about that night. Dad told me everything before he died, how you took the blame, how you carried it alone, how you gave up everything because you couldn't forgive yourself for an accident that could have happened to any of us. I'm not writing to offer you forgiveness. That's not mine to give. But I'm writing to tell you that your absence left a hole in this club that we never figured out how to fill. We needed you, Ezra. We still do. I don't know how much time I have left. The doctors say 6 months, maybe less. But before I go, I want you to know, the road is still here. The brothers are still here. And there's still a seat at the table with your name on it. Come home. Reed Knox. Dalton read the letter twice, 3 times. The words blurred, and he realized his eyes were wet. He knew he was dying, Dalton said quietly. He never told me. Never told anyone in the club. He just kept writing, kept showing up, right until the end. That sounds like a Knox. Ezra's voice was gentle. Your father was the same way. Never complained, never asked for help, just carried his weight and trusted that the road would take him where he needed to go. Dalton folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. His hands were steady, but something inside him had begun to tremble. Some wall he had built long ago, some barrier between the grief he felt and the grief he allowed himself to show. Reed's bike, he said, at the gas station. You weren't trying to steal from it. No, Ezra shook his head. I was trying to say goodbye. I was trying to tell him I was sorry I didn't make it in time. The letter, it took too long to reach me. By the time I found out he wanted me to come home, he was already gone. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The embers faded. The wind died down. Somewhere outside, the coyote had stopped howling, and the night had gone so quiet that Dalton could hear his own heartbeat, steady and slow, like the idle of an engine waiting to run. Finally, he stood. He crossed to the wall of photographs and studied them, the faces of the fallen, the brothers who had taken their last ride. There was Reed, grinning in a picture from 2 summers ago, his arm around Dalton's shoulder, both of them covered in road dust and looking like they had just discovered the secret to happiness. There was their father, Marcus, in a photo from the 70s, young and fierce, with eyes that burned like headlights in the dark. And there, at the very end of the row, in a frame that had hung empty for as long as Dalton could remember, a frame that the older brothers always said was waiting for someone, there was a space just big enough for one more face. You said the club covered up what happened to Deacon, Dalton said without turning around. You said my father made the decision, but decisions like that don't get made alone, not in a club, not in a brotherhood. The whole table would have had to vote. They did, and they voted to protect you, to let you disappear instead of facing what you'd done. Yes, Dalton turned. In the dim light, with the shadows of the clubhouse falling across his face, he looked older than his years. He looked like his father. Like his brother. Like every man who had ever worn the patch and carried its weight. Do you know why? He asked. Ezra shook his head. Because you were family. Dalton's voice was rough but steady. Because the club doesn't throw its own away. Not for mistakes, not for accidents, not even for the kind of grief that makes a man want to run until his legs give out. He paused. Reed understood that. That's why he wrote you. He didn't want you to come back and make things right. He wanted you to come back and stop punishing yourself for being human. And what do you want? Dalton walked to the bar. He picked up the bottle of whiskey, poured 2 fresh glasses, and carried them back. He held one out to Ezra. I want you to drink this, he said. And then I want you to sleep. There's a room in the back, nothing fancy, just a bed and 4 walls. But it's warm and it's dry, and it's yours for as long as you need it. Ezra took the glass. His hands were trembling again, but not from cold. And after that, Dalton raised his own glass. After that, we talk. About Deacon, about my father, about Reed, about all the ghosts that ride with us whether we want them to or not. He clinked his glass against Ezra's. But tonight, we drink. To the fallen. To the fallen, Ezra echoed. They drank. Morning came slowly to the clubhouse, filtering through dusty windows in shafts of pale gold. Dalton woke in his chair by the dead fireplace, his neck stiff and his mouth tasting of whiskey and regret. Bishop was still asleep on the couch, undisturbed. But the chair where Ezra had sat was empty. For a moment, Dalton wondered if the whole thing had been a dream, some vision conjured by grief and too many hours on the road. But then he saw it. The photograph, the one with the 7 founders, propped against the whiskey bottle on the table. And beside it, a note, in handwriting that shook slightly, as if the hand that wrote it had been unsteady. Dalton, thank you for the room. Thank you for the drink. But I've been running for 40 years, and I'm not sure I know how to stop. I'll be at Mercer's, by the bike. If you want to find me, that's where I'll be. If you don't come, I'll understand. Some ghosts are meant to stay buried. Ezra. Dalton read the note twice. Then he folded it, put it in his pocket, and walked out into the morning. The ride to Mercer's took 12 minutes. Dalton took it slow, letting the cool air clear his head, letting the hum of the engine settle his thoughts. The sky was the color of brushed steel, heavy with clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain or retreat. The road was empty, just him and the white lines and the endless stretch of Oklahoma prairie on either side. He found Ezra exactly where the note had promised, kneeling beside Reed's motorcycle, one hand resting on the fuel tank, head bowed. He wasn't praying, he wasn't crying, he was just present. Like a man who had finally stopped running and discovered that the thing he'd been running from had been inside him all along. Dalton parked his bike and walked over. He didn't speak. He just stood there, beside the old man, beside his brother's motorcycle, and watched the clouds drift overhead. I used to believe that the road could fix anything, Ezra said without looking up. That if you rode long enough, far enough, fast enough, you could outrun whatever was chasing you. But you can't, can you? The road doesn't take you away from your problems. It just gives you time to think about them. My father used to say the same thing. Dalton lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself level with Ezra. He said the road was like a mirror. It showed you who you really were, not who you wanted to be. Marcus was a wise man. He was, and so was Reed. Dalton reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. There's still a seat at the table with your name on it. Ezra finally looked up. His eyes were red but dry. That seat's been empty for 40 years. Then maybe it's time someone filled it. The clouds chose that moment to part, and a shaft of sunlight fell across the gas station, illuminating the old motorcycle in a halo of gold. It was the kind of light that felt intentional, the kind that showed up in movies when something important was about to happen. I can't just walk back into the clubhouse, Ezra said. I can't put on a patch and pretend the last 4 decades didn't happen. The brothers who knew me, they're all gone. The young ones, they don't even know my name. To them, I'd just be some old man who used to matter and doesn't anymore. You're wrong. Dalton stood, extending a hand to help Ezra up. The brothers don't care about names or history. They care about loyalty, about showing up when it counts, about carrying your weight and trusting your brothers to carry theirs. He paused. You want to know what they'll see when they look at you? They'll see a man who made a mistake and spent his whole life trying to make it right. They'll see someone who loved this club enough to walk away rather than bring shame to it. And they'll see the founder, the man who gave them something worth believing in, even if they never knew his name. Ezra's hand trembled as he reached for Dalton's. His grip was weak, but his eyes were steady. "And what do you see?" he asked. Dalton pulled him to his feet. "I see my brother's last wish, and I see my father's oldest friend." He released Ezra's hand and stepped back. "Come to the clubhouse tonight, 7 o'clock. We're holding a memorial for Reed. A year and a half late, but better late than never. The whole club will be there. Every brother, every prospect, every old lady who ever loved a man in a patch. What do you want me to do? Tell them the truth about Deacon. About why you left. About everything." Dalton's voice was firm, but not unkind. "The club deserves to know its own history, and you deserve to stop carrying this weight alone." Ezra looked at the motorcycle, at Reed's motorcycle, one last time. He ran his fingers across the fuel tank, across the dented chrome, across the cracked leather seat that had molded itself to his friend's shape over years of riding. "He never gave up on me," Ezra said quietly, "even when I gave up on myself. That's what brothers do." Ezra nodded slowly. Something in his posture shifted, a straightening of the spine, a squaring of the shoulders, the subtle transformation of a man deciding to stop running. 7 o'clock, he said. 7 o'clock. Dalton climbed back on his bike and kicked the engine to life. The roar filled the morning, echoing off the gas station walls, scattering a flock of crows that had gathered on the power lines. He looked at Ezra one last time, nodded once, and pulled onto the road. In his mirrors, he watched the old man stand beside the motorcycle, watching him go, growing smaller and smaller, until he was just a speck against the Oklahoma sky. The clubhouse was full by 6:30. Brothers arrived in waves. First the officers, then the full patches, then the prospects who weren't sure if they were allowed to be there but came anyway, because a memorial was a memorial, and you didn't miss those. The main room had been transformed. Candles on every surface. Photographs of Reed arranged on a table near the fireplace. A black cloth draped over his empty chair at the officer's table. Dalton stood near the bar, nursing a beer he had no intention of finishing, watching the room fill. Bishop was there, finally sober, his face drawn with the particular grief of a man who had lost too many friends. Hawk and Diesel were talking quietly in the corner, their voices too low to carry. The old ladies, wives, girlfriends, daughters of the club, clustered near the kitchen, preparing food that nobody would eat but everyone would appreciate. At exactly 7 o'clock, the front door opened. Ezra Cole stepped through. He had cleaned up, shaved the worst of the beard, washed the road from his face, found a shirt that didn't smell like a decade of homeless shelters. But he still looked like what he was, an old man, weathered by years and regret, walking into a room full of strangers who didn't know they were about to meet a ghost. The conversation died. Every eye turned to the door. Dalton saw the recognition on the faces of the oldest brothers, the ones who had been around long enough to remember the stories, the legends, the whispered name of the founder who had vanished before most of them were born. "Brothers," Dalton said, stepping forward, "this is Ezra Cole. Some of you know that name. Most of you don't, but you're about to." He led Ezra to the front of the room, to the empty space beside Reed's photograph, and turned to face the assembled club. 43 years ago, Dalton began, 7 men started this club. They were veterans, brothers, men who had seen things no one should have to see and done things no one should have to do. They came home from a war that didn't want them and built something new, a family, a code, a way of life. Everything we are, everything we have, everything we believe, it all started with them. He paused, letting the words settle. One of those men was my father, Marcus Knox. Another was a man named Carl Jessup, Deacon, they called him. And the one who brought them all together, the one who wore the first patch and sat in the first president's chair, was the man standing beside me right now. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dalton raised a hand and the room fell silent. Ezra's been gone a long time, 40 years. Most of you weren't even born when he left. But he's here now, and he's got something to say. Something about our history, our founder, and the brother we lost too soon. He turned to Ezra. "The floor is yours." Ezra stepped forward. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at the faces arrayed before him. Young and old, hard and soft, skeptical and curious. Then he began to speak. He told them everything. About the founding, about the early days, about Deacon, his best friend, his brother, the man he had killed on a rainy night in 1983. He told them about the cover-up, about the vote, about his father's decision to let him disappear rather than face the consequences. He told them about the decades of wandering, the shelters and soup kitchens, the endless attempt to balance scales that couldn't be balanced. And he told them about Reed's letter, about the invitation to come home, about arriving too late, finding only a motorcycle chained to a gas pump, and a brother who had died still believing in him. When he finished, the room was silent. The candles flickered. The photographs of Reed seemed to watch from their frames, waiting to see what would happen next. It was Bishop who spoke first. He rose from his seat, crossed the room, and stood directly in front of Ezra. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. The old founder and the current road captain, separated by generations, but connected by something deeper. Then Bishop extended his hand. "You made a mistake," he said, "a bad one, but you paid for it. 40 years of running, 40 years of guilt, 40 years of trying to be someone better than the man who made that choice." He paused. Reed saw that. Dalton sees it, and now we see it too. Ezra's hand trembled as he reached out to meet Bishop's grip. "I don't deserve." "It's not about deserving." Bishop's voice was firm. "It's about family. And family doesn't turn its back. Not on a mistake. Not on 40 years of absence. Not on anything." One by one, the other brothers rose. They crossed the room. They extended their hands. Some clapped Ezra on the shoulder. Others simply nodded. The silent acknowledgement of men who understood that words weren't always necessary. Dalton watched it happen, and something in his chest loosened. Some knot of grief and anger that had been tightening since the night he'd found Ezra at the gas station. This was what Reed had wanted. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but something simpler. Connection. The end of isolation. The knowledge that no matter how far you ran, the road would always lead you home. The memorial lasted until midnight. There were speeches and silences, laughter and tears, stories about Reed that ranged from the ridiculous to the profound. Someone brought out an old guitar and played the songs they used to sing on long rides. Road hymns, they called them, the unofficial soundtrack of the Iron Veil. Through it all, Ezra sat in a chair near the fireplace, surrounded by brothers he didn't know, but who had accepted him anyway. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The living proof that the club's past and present were connected, that the chain of loyalty stretched back further than any of them had imagined. Near the end of the night, Dalton found him alone, standing in front of the wall of photographs. The empty frame at the end of the row, the one that had been waiting for 40 years, now held the picture of the 7 founders, the one Ezra had carried with him through 4 decades of wandering. "It belongs there," Ezra said quietly. "They all belong there." Yes. Dalton stood beside him, studying the faces of men he had never met, but somehow knew. They do. What happens now? It was the question Dalton had been asking himself all night. What did happen now? Ezra was too old to ride, too frail to prospect, too far removed from the club's current business to contribute in any practical way. He was a symbol, a legend, a living piece of history, but history didn't pay the bills or guard the clubhouse or show up when things got hard. And yet, "There's a cabin," Dalton said slowly, "about 10 miles from here. Used to belong to my father. It's not much, 4 walls, a roof, a fireplace that works when it feels like it, but it's quiet, and it's close." Ezra turned to look at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've spent 40 years trying to run from this place. Maybe it's time you tried staying." Dalton reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Old, tarnished, the kind of key that opened doors built before anyone alive had been born. "The cabin's yours, for as long as you want it. No rent, no obligations, no expectations. Just a place to be when you need to be somewhere." Ezra stared at the key. His eyes, pale and tired, filled with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of the firelight. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything." Dalton pressed the key into his hand. "Just take it, and when you're ready, come to the clubhouse. Have dinner with us. Tell the prospects about the old days. Let the brothers know what this club was built on and what it's supposed to mean. And if I'm not ready, if I can never be ready." Dalton smiled, a small smile, tired but genuine. "Then we'll wait. We've been waiting 40 years. We can wait a little longer." Ezra closed his fingers around the key. He held it tight, like a drowning man holding a rope, like a lost man holding a map. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." "Don't thank me." Dalton clapped him on the shoulder. "Thank Reed. He's the one who brought you home." 2 weeks later, Dalton rode out to check on the cabin. The road was familiar. The same turns, the same hills, the same stretches of emptiness that he had traveled 1,000 times before. His father had loved this road. Reed had loved it too. Now, Dalton rode it alone, feeling their absence like a passenger on the back of his bike, a weight that never quite went away. The cabin appeared through the trees, small and weathered, smoke rising from the chimney. The front porch had been swept clean, and there was a rocking chair, one he didn't recognize, positioned to face the sunset. Ezra was sitting in it. He looked different than he had at the memorial, less fragile, more present. The beard was trimmed, the clothes were clean, and there was color in his cheeks that hadn't been there before. "You came," he said as Dalton parked his bike and walked up to the porch. "Told you I would. People say a lot of things they don't mean. I meant it." Ezra gestured to a second chair, another one Dalton didn't recognize, but that had clearly been placed there for exactly this purpose. "Sit. I made coffee." They sat together on the porch, drinking coffee that was too strong, and watching the sun dip toward the horizon. The sky turned orange, then pink, then the deep purple that came just before dark. Neither man spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Finally, Ezra broke the silence. "I've been thinking about Deacon." Dalton nodded, but didn't interrupt. "For 40 years, I told myself that what happened was unforgivable, that I killed my best friend and didn't deserve to be forgiven for it. But sitting here, in this cabin, with all this quiet," he paused, searching for words, "I'm starting to wonder if maybe I was wrong." "About what?" "About forgiveness." Ezra set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. "I always thought forgiveness was something you earned, something you had to work for, suffer for, prove yourself worthy of. But now I think maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe forgiveness is just deciding to stop punishing yourself. Maybe it's just choosing to live instead of spending the rest of your days dying." Dalton considered this. He thought about his father, who had made the choice to let Ezra go. He thought about Reed, who had written a letter to a man everyone else had forgotten. He thought about himself, standing at that gas station in the rain, ready to fight a homeless man he thought was stealing from the dead. "My brother used to say that guilt was just love with nowhere to go," Dalton said. "He said it was what happened when you cared about someone and couldn't figure out how to show it anymore." Ezra nodded slowly. "That sounds like something a Knox would say." "It is." Dalton finished his coffee and set the cup beside Ezra's. "So let me ask you something. After all these years, after everything you've been through, do you still feel guilty?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. The last light of the sun caught his face, illuminating the scars, the wrinkles, the map of a life spent in motion. "Yes," he said finally, "but it's different now. It's not the kind of guilt that wants to punish me. It's the kind that wants me to do better, to be better." He looked at Dalton. "Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense." They sat in silence as the sun disappeared and the stars began to emerge, one by one, like candles being lit in a distant church. "I want to do something," Ezra said, "for the club, for Reed, for everyone who gave me a second chance I didn't deserve." "What did you have in mind?" Ezra reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, folded and worn. He handed it to Dalton. "It's a list," he said. "Names and addresses. All the brothers who were there at the beginning. The ones who were still alive, anyway. Most of them left the club years ago. Some of them had falling outs, disagreements, the usual stuff that happens when men spend too much time together. But they're still out there, still breathing, still carrying the memories of what we built." Dalton unfolded the paper. 6 names, 6 addresses, 6 pieces of a past he hadn't known existed. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Find them. Invite them to the clubhouse. Tell them the founder is back and he wants to see them one more time before he dies." Ezra's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a tremor, a fragility, the awareness that time was not unlimited. "I want to apologize to all of them for disappearing, for leaving them to carry the weight alone, for 40 years of silence when I should have been standing beside them." Dalton folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. "I'll find them. Thank you." They sat on the porch until the stars filled the sky, until the coffee was gone and the night had grown cold enough to see their breath. Then Dalton stood, stretched, and walked to his bike. "One more thing," he said, turning back. Ezra looked up. "Reed's bike. The one at Mercer's." Dalton paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about what to do with it. It's been sitting there for almost 2 years now, just rusting, just waiting. And I think Reed would have wanted someone to ride it, someone who understands what it means." Ezra's eyes widened. "You can't be serious?" "I'm completely serious." Dalton swung a leg over his own motorcycle and kicked the engine to life. "I'll have Bishop bring it out here tomorrow. And maybe, when you're ready, when the guilt turns into something you can carry instead of something that carries you, maybe you'll ride again. I haven't ridden in 40 years. Then it's about time you started." Dalton smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and warmed the cold Oklahoma night. Then he revved the engine, pulled onto the dirt road, and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Ezra alone on the porch with the stars overhead and a future he hadn't dared to imagine. 3 months passed. The leaves changed, fell, and the first frost covered the ground. The club gathered for holidays and memorials, for rides and rallies, for all the rituals that bound them together across generations. Ezra came to the clubhouse twice a week. He sat with the brothers, told stories of the old days, answered questions from prospects who wanted to know what the club had been like before they were born. He ate dinner at the long table, drank whiskey by the fire, and slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, become part of the fabric of the Iron Veil again. Reed's motorcycle sat in his cabin now, cleaned and restored, polished until the chrome gleamed like new. Ezra hadn't ridden it yet, hadn't even sat on it, but sometimes, late at night, he would stand beside it in the moonlight, running his hands across the fuel tank, remembering. The founders came. One by one, Dalton tracked them down. 6 old men scattered across 3 states, living quiet lives in small towns, nursing grudges and regrets that had festered for decades. He told them about Ezra, about the memorial, about the club's decision to welcome him back. Some came willingly, some came reluctantly. One, a man named Garrett, who had left the club after a fight with Marcus Knox in 1979, came with tears in his eyes and apology on his lips, ready to make peace with ghosts he had carried for longer than he could remember. They gathered at the clubhouse on a Saturday in late November. 7 old men who had once been young, once been brothers, once been the foundation of something larger than themselves. They sat around the long table where they had made decisions together 40 years ago, and they talked. They talked about the beginning, about the war, about the reasons they had started the club and the reasons some of them had left. They talked about Deacon, about who he had been, what he had meant, why his loss had fractured something that had seemed unbreakable. And when the talking was done, when the old wounds had been opened and cleaned and bound again, they rode. 7 motorcycles, 7 old men. One last ride down the roads they had built their lives on, through towns that had changed and towns that hadn't, past fields and forests and the endless Oklahoma sky. Ezra rode in the lead. It was his first time on a motorcycle in 40 years, and his hands shook on the handlebars, and his heart pounded in his chest like it was trying to escape. But he rode. And beside him, behind him, around him, the brothers rode too. A formation of ghosts and survivors, of legends and men, of everything the Iron Veil had been, and everything it still could be. They ended at Mercer's gas station, at the spot where Reed's motorcycle had sat for almost 2 years, chained to the pump island like a memorial. The chain was gone now. Dalton had removed it the week after the memorial. But the spot remained, marked by a small plaque that read simply, Reed Cox, brother, son, legend. The road remembers. Ezra parked his bike beside the plaque and killed the engine. The other founders pulled up around him, one by one, forming a semicircle of chrome and leather and age-spotted hands. For a long time, no one spoke. The wind blew. The neon sign of Mercer's flickered. The clouds drifted overhead, indifferent to the history unfolding beneath them. Then Garrett, the one who had left after the fight, the one who had carried his grudge for 40 years, stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flask. He unscrewed the cap, poured a measure of whiskey onto the ground beside the plaque, and spoke. To Reed Knox, and to all the brothers who rode before us. The others echoed the toast, their voices rough with age and emotion. One by one, they stepped forward and added their own measure of whiskey to the ground, until the earth was dark with it, until the air smelled of liquor and memory and the particular kind of sorrow that came with saying goodbye. When it was Ezra's turn, he didn't pour the whiskey. Instead, he knelt beside the plaque and placed his hand on the cold metal, feeling the grooves of the letters beneath his fingers. "I should have been here," he said quietly, so quietly that only the wind could hear. "I should have been here for you, for your father, for all of it." He closed his eyes. "But I'm here now, and I'm not running anymore." He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the Oklahoma dust, making peace with the dead. And when he finally rose, there were tears on his cheeks, but his eyes were clear and his spine was straight, and for the first time in 40 years, he looked like a man who had found his way home. Dalton watched from a distance, leaning against his motorcycle, giving the founders their space. When Ezra finally stood and walked toward him, he straightened and met him halfway. "How do you feel?" he asked. Ezra considered the question, really considered it, like a man taking inventory of his soul. "Tired," he said, Old, sore in places I forgot I had. He paused. But also, free. For the first time in 40 years, I feel free. Dalton nodded. He understood. Not completely. No one could completely understand another man's burden, but enough. Enough to know that what had happened here today mattered, that it would ripple forward through the club's history, changing things in ways they couldn't yet see. "What happens now?" Ezra asked. It was the same question he had asked at the memorial 3 months ago, but this time the answer was different. "Now," Dalton said, "you live, you ride, you tell stories to the prospects, and drink whiskey with the brothers, and fall asleep by the fire when the nights get cold." He clapped Ezra on the shoulder. "And when the time comes, when you take your last ride, whenever that is, we'll be there, all of us, sending you off the way a brother deserves to be sent." Ezra's eyes glistened. "You do that? For me?" "We'd do it for any of us," Dalton smiled. "That's what family means." The founders were mounting their bikes now, preparing for the ride back to the clubhouse. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the road stretched out before them like a promise waiting to be kept. Ezra looked at his motorcycle, Reed's motorcycle, his motorcycle now, and felt something shift inside him. The guilt was still there. It would always be there, he knew, but it was smaller now, quieter, less like a prison and more like a scar, a reminder of what he had lost, but also of what he had survived. He climbed onto the bike. He gripped the handlebars. He felt the engine rumble beneath him, steady and strong, like a heartbeat, like a prayer. And then he rode. Into the sunset, into the future, into whatever remained of a life he had almost thrown away. Behind him, the brothers followed. Dalton rode at his side, Bishop and Hawk and Diesel forming the rear guard. The old founders scattered throughout, like ghosts returning to the land of the living. And somewhere above, in the clouds, in the wind, in the fading light of the Oklahoma sky, Reed Knox watched and smiled. The road went on. The brotherhood endured. And Ezra Cole, founder of the Iron Veil, finally came home.